All right, so for our last section, what we're going to do is, instead of a traditional panel, how we have this set up is kind of 3 miniature lectures. So 3 mini talks that will last about 15-20 minutes. And the idea behind this talk is to delve more deeply into the idea of landscape and how when you go throughout the exhibition, we're looking at so many landscapes of Iowa. And so we have 3 very different speakers here to talk about 3 different perspectives on a changing landscape in the landscape of Iowa. So the first person you're going to hear from is Dr. Lee Burras. He is a professor here at Iowa State University in the Agronomy department. So I think I've put Lee a little bit out of his comfort zone here in giving him a exhibition symposium in a museum, but he has gratefully agreed to come and talk to us a little bit from an ecology, from an agronomy perspective about Iowa and its landscape. So please help me welcome Lee. You have your own.
Good afternoon. As you heard, I'm Lee, and I'm the guy that put together this one sheet of paper that I'll talk about as opposed to a PowerPoint or something. And what I wanted to start with, though, is by very much thanking Leah, Lila, and Lynette for having me speak. And I think it's because my name's Lee that I got to speak. But I very much want to thank everyone for letting me be here. The second thing is I really want to say that I'm the least qualified person to be here because I really don't understand art. I love art. I wish I was much better at it, but I'm not good with art, and I've learned so much. It's been a really steep learning curve throughout the day as I've been here, but it's been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed it, so thank you all very much. And then the next thing I was going to say, I've heard this earlier from more than one speaker, is we're really thinking about place often, and I'm someone that very, very much spends my day thinking about places, and within that, my first rule is when I think about a place, is that I see what I know, or I really will say, we see what we know. And so as only these paintings and such I'm looking at, I'm seeing stuff that I can relate to, and then I'm trying to build from there. And then beyond that, I put here in what you have in front of you, the land of Iowa, a pedologist perspective. Well, I'm a pedologist, and so as that, I'm a soil scientist who thinks about the world in three ways. The first way is I very much think about the whole world as a set of natural features. Entirely natural. So start with the idea of geology. And sort of to illustrate that is this first gray image. The first 3 images sort of really illustrate sort of the 3 upper images, 2 maps of Iowa, put together by Catherine DeLong, who's here somewhere. There she is, Catherine. Thank you, Catherine. But anyway, these 3 images, the first one is the gray thing, and you say, well, Lee, that's really ugly. You can sort of see a little bit of Lake Superior, a little bit of Lake Michigan. What you can see if you look down sort of the middle of it is there seems to be sort of a flatter or smoother gray color coming down. That's actually where the most recent glacier came into Iowa. It's called the Moines Lobe. You can see where it came out from northern Canada down into central Iowa. By the way, we can also see where it seems like there's another low gray lobe to the west of it that extends down to South Dakota. That's the James Lobe. What that was 14,000 years ago. So when I talk about as a natural world, 14,000, well, a little more than that, but 14,000 years ago, a glacier slid down into Iowa and up at the Prairie Coteau region, where Pipestone National Monument would be. There was a slightly harder rock that the Native Americans were mining even, after the glacier left, but were mining that slightly harder rock caused a glacier to split. And that glacial split, for the case of Iowa, gave us the second map where you see this nice blue tongue called the Moines Lobe. So when I see Iowa, I'm starting to think of these different regions tied back to the glacial history. And then coming back to this first image, we can even see where the Missouri River is flowing along the western border of Iowa. That wide river valley is so wide because all the water melting from that glacier was, every summer when that glacier was around, all this water was melting out front of it because summers were hot even when the glacier's around. Lots of water melts. Some of you may have seen a glacier on a tour somewhere. Huge amounts of water is melting in the summer, and all that water melting out resulted in lots of sediment also flowing with that meltwater. And then in the winter, since there's glaciers nearby, it froze like you can't believe. There were winds like you can't believe, and that blew up the lush hills you can see in western Iowa. all that. So when I start thinking about the world, the first thing I start thinking about is I see all this as natural features, things that have a distribution, a presence that I can understand if I start working my way back to the geology. And then after I go from geology, I say, well, after the glacier left for us, what happened? Well, it started to warm up. As it warmed up, the climate kept changing, getting a little more moist. And then eventually prairie took over Iowa. And this next map down is just showing really the reddish area is showing where the prairies were, the black soils we have now. So the very dark mollisols, as I might call them, Chernozyms, if you're into a Russian classification system. So we start getting a set of different soils. And all that has a very logical pattern to it. And that's what this image down on the bottom is showing is, if around here, if I went from a hill on top where it's blue down to the red at the bottom, there's a very systematic distribution of every property I could possibly want to look at: soil property, landscape property. So coming back to it, what I put over here is I said I think about soils in very much of a natural distribution. There are systematic features, there are mappable features. But then the second thing is, I'm a professor of agronomy, so the way I really think of the land, and I look at these images, not only am I looking at sort of the natural components, which we'll come back to, but I see all the beautiful art in terms of what are they showing us economically, because we see land as economic features. That's how most people see it. You buy or sell a parcel of land. Is it $5,000 an acre? Is it this or that? And so it's economic features, and it's economic because we can manage it. And if we manage it with sophistication, we can make a huge amount of money, or we might lose money, and those sorts of things. But basically what it is land is economics. So to me, it's a natural feature, but most of the people I interact with see it as an economic feature. Can I make money with it or not? Or alternatively, they see it as anti-economic, so to speak, but it's not the way we say it, is we want to have it for some sort of, we want to have it as a preserve, or we want to have it as a park, which I'm all for. Those are social, economic, cultural features, however you want to say it. And then the third thing I want to point out, I'm well aware, and I work very much with land because we see it as a cultural feature. And to say a little bit differently, as I see land and landscapes, is it fair for me to say Iowa takes great pride in that we lead the country in corn production? Yeah, I think our governor would agree with that. We take great pride in that. We also take great pride in that we see have these black soils. But it's really interesting then, as I work with artists, I work with historians, like we've heard through the day, is because I'm looking at the paintings here, the art, and again, it's beautiful, and I'm seeing that sort of a change from how much we emphasize the natural part to how much we emphasize the economic part, and how we, within the value system that I say we have, as I look at the art, because like Chief Keokuk, he's painted with the river in the background and the woods in the background. So that's very much a set of natural features. He's also painted an area where it'd be very brown soil, so it would not be these nice black soils. And also all the early artwork is from the eastern Iowa. As we heard this morning too, it would be the Black Hawk Purchase, which was basically 50 miles east. That was the best area in the world to buy because it was brown soils. Because at that time, these black soils we now take so much pride in were impossible to farm. The plow of the day would not cut that land, so you couldn't raise the crops. So the land we now have Iowa State University on would have been considered almost a great swampland, not just because it was black and wet, but because it was unmanageable from an economic feature point of view. But as I look at the paintings as they go on more to the regionalism and such, I'm seeing, as opposed to the river systems, now the more uplands are being emphasized. The rolling landscapes, I'm seeing the economic component, the way the farmstead fits into the land, and all that really reflects to me a historical change through railroads. So it changed how people could migrate, and also changed in terms of the industrial component that we could now manage even these most intransigent soils and turn them into an economic feature that we value differently. So that's how I've been interacting and thinking about the day and everything. And I guess, and so by the way, the last thing I'll really sort of say here is these last images here, one is showing arable land, arable soils with, those are actual animal burrowing. That's showing that over a study I worked with a visiting Russian scientist, Yuri Chindov, a Fulbright fellow, and Tom Sauer, who's with the Agricultural Research Service, so national scientist. We were looking at how, as we humans use the lands of eastern Iowa and have taken them from forest to cropland, how have they changed properties, and they changed a tremendous amount. The bottom two ugly little squares, those are showing a native prairie, the top 4 inches, a thin section, and so I'm showing how much black, which would either be mineral or organic matter, and the white is porosity, how the porosity of the soil has changed as you and I use it, and it's become more, bluntly more compact, so it can now have less water infiltrate, and if it can't infiltrate, then it might flood. So all these pedestrian changes, and I just always am very interested in what you and I, as we try to understand the natural world, manage as an economic feature to fit our cultural values, how we're changing things in ways that are unanticipated and maybe will be to our own detriment. And personally, I think the art shows the same idea, but I won't go that far and say that right now. But anyway, that's sort of how I see the world, and I've used my time, I think, and so I'll wait till there are questions, but I'm happy to talk about it. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Jerome Thompson, and he comes, he's the retired State of Iowa Curator, worked for the State of Iowa a long time, worked with the State Historical Society, and he's going to speak a little bit about how we think about land use and ownership of land, which I think really fits into a lot of the topics that we've had today. Help me to welcome Jerome for our next mini talk.
Okay. I think I'm blocked out.
There we go.
Well, in 1835, Lieutenant Albert Miller Lee was set out on an expedition along with the 1st U.S. Dragoons to explore the area of the Des Moines and the Raccoon Rivers to try to find a suitable place to build a military fort. In 1836, Albert Miller Lee wrote a small pamphlet or book called Notes on the Wisconsin Territory with particular reference to the Iowa District. At the time, Iowa was part of Wisconsin Territory and did not become a territory of its own until 1838. Lee's book was really an immigrant's guide to Iowa. He had all sorts of glowing things to say about this place and about how you could make your living here. It was basically, his impressions. He had seen a good portion of the entire state, but the only area that was open for settlement, has been mentioned today, is this strip in here, which was acquired after the 1832 Black Hawk War. Of course, before the first Euro-Americans claimed land in Iowa, it was home at different periods of time to the Iowa, the Sauk or Meskwaki, Dakota, Ho-Chunk, Winnebago, Omaha, Otos, Missourias, Potawatomis, and a few others that kind of left some footprints here as they were moved to other places from other places. Each of these nations had a different view of Euro-Americans of the use of land. Francis LaFlesche, a member of the Omaha Nation, and a Smithsonian ethnologist, wrote in the early 20th century, "White people speak of the country at this period as a wilderness, as though it was an empty tract without human interest or history. To us Indians, it was clearly defined then as today. We knew the boundaries of tribal lands and those of our friends and foes." Oops. Lands were not owned by Native people. They were used communally. Ecological historian William Cronin wrote, "What Indians owned, or more precisely, what villages gave them to claim, was not the land, but the things that were on the land at various seasons of the year. An individual's or a family's rights to property were defined by the community, which recognized those rights, whereas the community's territorial claims were made in opposition to those of other sovereign people." Cronin also observed that Europeans for whom material possessions indicated perceived status, they perceived of Native people to be living in poverty. Europeans judged Native people as understanding of the land of plenty and thus rejected their claims. This attitude from the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century paved the way for the displacement and removal of Native people from their traditional lands. It's not a fire alarm. That's good.
It's not a fire alarm. It's someone went through that.
Two very early acts of the new American Republic had a profound impact on this land we call Iowa. The first was the Land Ordinance of 1785, and the second was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Each had land ownership at their core and shaped this state. An aerial view of Iowa shows distinct square and rectangular shapes of city streets and farm fields. We have the Land Ordinance of 1785 to thank for that. This act set forth a system of surveying, dividing, and disposing of, quote, territory ceded by the individual states to the United States, which has been purchased of the Indian inhabitants, end quote. Federally hired surveyors were to divide the territory into townships of 6 miles square by lines running due north and south and others crossing at right angles. The townships shall be, quote, marked by subdivisions into lots of 1 square mile or 640 acres. The lands of the Northwest Territory, which became Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, were so divided. This principle of land division carried over into the Louisiana Purchase, which included Iowa. Common terms such as township, range, section, quarter section, front 40, back 40, all have their origins with this act. There we have it. Settlers coming to new lands didn't want to wait until the official surveys were done. And the federal lands were placed up for sale at $1.25 an acre. Instead, settlers placed claims on lands by marking trees, building log pens, plowing the ground, or making other, quote, improvements. Settlers formed claim clubs which vowed to not bid against a neighbor when the lands came up for official sale. In 1839, the Iowa Territorial Assembly passed, quote, an act to prevent trespass and other injuries done to the possession of settlers on the public domain, legalizing an extra-legal system of settlement. The Northwest Ordinance, at its core, wait a minute. Okay. Those are the Northwest Territories, and this, by the way, this is Ames, Iowa, from the original land survey maps. I think we're about right there. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, at its core, codified the manner in which new lands would become territories of the United States and requirements for statehood. The ownership of the land was key. In order for men to vote or hold office, they must own land. For example, the governor of a territory appointed by the president and Congress must reside in a district and have a freehold estate therein of 1,000 acres. Judges had to own 500 acres, as did members of the territorial legislatures. To serve as a representative, one had to own 200 acres, and to vote, you had to own 50 acres. Without land, you were essentially no one. In other words, if you were a blacksmith or a tradesman, you could not vote. You had to own property. The Northwest Ordinance prohibited slavery in the territories, but this tended to be ignored. It was also colorblind to land ownership, so free African Americans were able to purchase lands, and they did. They could also vote and hold office. According to the 1860 census, nearly 65,000 African Americans made their homes in the old Northwest Territories. But freedom promised by the Northwest Ordinance was gradually eroded by the implementation of black exclusion laws. As each territory became a state, the Constitution included provisions that only white men could vote. Recent scholarship on this subject is found in the 2018 book by Anna Lee Cox, The Bone and Sinew of the Land, America's Forgotten Black Pioneers and the Struggle for Equality. Land was important to Iowa. The first state constitution proposed in 1844, but not approved by Congress, was primarily because the proposed state boundaries were everything north to the Minnesota River. So everything south of Minneapolis and St. Paul would have been in Iowa. Land ownership as a voting requirement did not carry through into the territorial organization that affected Iowa, nor did the state constitution approved in 1846. At the same time, the territorial government passed a law requiring African Americans to present freedom papers and to post bonds of $500 with the sheriff or magistrate to live here. Lawmakers who wrote this did not ignore the importance of land ownership. Article 2 of the state constitution begins, "All men are by nature free and independent and have certain inalienable rights, among which are enjoying and defending life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and protecting property." While women could not vote, they were not ignored by the territorial legislature. They passed a bill that provided that women could own property in their own names. In other words, a woman who inherited property from her family, if she married, had to transfer those rights to her husband. That changed that. Kind of progressive for the time, but it was a movement forward. As mentioned before, the Meskwaki Nation came back to Iowa and purchased lands. They were very smart in the way that they used the structure of land ownership to maintain their sovereignty. To kind of wrap this up, land ownership, land succession is still important today. There are 1,219 references to the term real estate in the Iowa Code and 5,271 references to the term land. Thanks.
So our last section here for landscape, we're going to talk about gendering of landscape, particularly in this exhibition. How do we think about landscape in terms of gender? So to do that, we have Dr. Maura Lyons. She is a professor of art history at Drake University. So please help me in welcoming her.
Thank you. I want to start by thanking Leah DeLong for inviting me to participate in this wonderful symposium. And I want to say from the outset that any observations that I offer are due to the fact that she has put in the hard work to assemble the artworks in the exhibition and to construct a history for them. So I am very grateful for that opportunity to think about something that is new to me. I also want to thank Adrienne Jeanette and Lila Anderson for their help as well. So I'm going to start with a painting that might seem very far removed from Iowa art. It's a painting by a Belgian surrealist artist, Mer Rene Magritte. But I think it's a good way to start thinking a little bit about the issues related to landscape that I want to raise with you. And I think one of Magritte gives us some sense of landscape imagery as a visual language that has certain structures, and that those structures, in the same way that words or syntax would be important in analyzing a written language, that we can find similar kinds of components when we think about landscape imagery. One of the many questions that Magritte raises here is what viewpoint do we use when we regard nature? In the painting, we see nature through several intermediaries, not just the curtain window, but more dramatically, the painted canvas on the easel placed in front of that window. And just so that's visible to everybody, there is the legs of the easel and then the edge of the canvas. Without denying the reality of an outdoors, Magritte suggests that our cultural expectations affect the way that we view, represent, and shape landscape. And the framework that I want to use in looking at landscape art from the exhibition is the understanding and expectations of gender, focusing on landscape images where the human figure appears. If we take gender as one organizing category of our reality, then I think decided patterns begin to emerge. And we'll question the relationship of gendered figure and landscape in the same way that Magritte juxtaposes painting and landscape view, asking us how we are situated as viewers. So I want to start with a print that is in the exhibition by John Caspar Wilde. Like many landscape images of Iowa from this period, the scene is one that emphasizes Euro-American settlement as a marker of progress. And thinking back to the Magritte painting I started with, we see the scene of the emergent city of Dubuque across the river through the intermediary of older structures in the foreground, including this expanded log cabin that we see at center. So one way to think about this painting, again, if you're thinking structurally, is that we are seeing the span of physical distance also marking the passage of time. So we move from the log structures on our side of the river to the steamboats in the river, to the multi-story buildings and the urban density of Dubuque beyond. And the witness to the scene is a sketching artist. We see the bustling city from his vantage point, a position that has traditionally connoted a degree of possession. And in fact, Wilde's signature actually appears on the hill behind this artist. The male artist is not the owner of what he surveys, but he is both witness and historian. Leah DeLong has documented that Wilde, like many of his contemporaries, needed to move around in order to sustain an artistic career. It's worth saying that this mobility, however imposed by the market, was simply one not available to female artists. It would have been inappropriate for a female artist to travel on her own. So the placement of the artist in this print, therefore, already denotes a gendered position in relation to the landscape. And when we look at a survey of other landscape images from the exhibition, and I show you a range of those, obviously not everything in the show, but a selection, we can see that the inclusion of a decisive male figure was not an anomaly. In the artworks on the screen, which represent different cultures, periods, and styles, we see male figures in relation to nature, whether wild or cultivated. From this selection, we learn that the landscape is an arena in which men hunt, fish, labor, and lead. But I don't want to suggest that these depictions are uniform, that there are changing ways in which the male figure relates to his surroundings. In some instances, he takes a commanding role in the landscape. And in these examples, the three that I have here, the male figures address the viewer directly and confidently. They loom above the horizon line. And because of their placement in the compositions, we encounter them before we see the landscape. The landscape receives meaning in relation to them, whether we're looking at a depiction of a native leader or a farmer. In other landscapes, and these two, it's important to note, date from the 1930s, the relationship is more ambiguous, showing uncertainty or instability. Whether in the strangely ritualized action of tree planting that we see at left, or driving through an unstable landscape where we see the contrast between a modern gasoline pump and a horse-drawn carriage. And I think it's a fair question to ask whether the uncertainty that we see in these examples acknowledges some crisis of masculinity connected to the Depression, when so many men were out of work and struggling. And we heard about the dire nature of those conditions this morning. By extension, does the acknowledgement of anxiety in these examples also highlight the creative effort involved in landscapes from the same period that show men as active and purposeful? And certainly there are examples of that in the show as well. So what we see or what we don't see, I think, is important in terms of the period. In yet other examples from the exhibition, the male figures are embedded compositionally in a network of landforms, plants, and animals. The figures in these artworks don't acknowledge the presence of the viewer, creating a more private scene. The men are anchored to their surroundings through leading lines that suggest spiritual and physical connection. And just to point out a couple of them, one of the real highlights of the exhibition, the Wakizashi Drawing, as the label Leah writes about in the catalog, the fact that a warrior draws power from his connection with a range of animals. He is part of this interconnected network. If we look at Lee Allen's mural in the center, in which the hunter and the fisher in the foreground stand directly in the water, once again we see male figures who are embedded in, they are part of their environment. In contrast, when women are seen in relation to the landscape as you walk through the exhibition, it is usually in one of two ways. One is from protected interiors, whether a luxurious ladies on a train or in a well-appointed home. In both these examples, the women are absorbed by something other than the landscape view. They do not direct our attention toward it in a way that many of the previous male figures did in the examples that I've shown. Another way that we see women is in the company of male figures. With the exception of Christian Peterson's drawing in the upper left, which Dr. DeLong speculates might show a returning veteran and his wife, all the other artworks imagine an earlier moment in Iowa's history. In these recreations of a past Iowa, women are present, but gender roles are clearly delineated. And that's true in Christian Peterson's illustration for the children's book about historical Meskwaki life, where we see in this particular version of the study for an illustration, a woman and young boys who are gathering reeds, not adult men. We see this in the Ding Darling print, where it's not accidental that the man and his son are the first to encounter the outstretched prairie as they walk in front of the covered wagon, which carries both a woman and an infant. And then in John Sharp's mural, both men and women work, but they are clearly occupying different zones. And I would say that the apple tree laden with fruit that is associated with the farm wife here, that it symbolizes the fertility, her fertility, and not just the fertility of the space, such that if you follow the branch of this apple tree, which is laden with fruit, and the spill of apples, it brings us to her elder son, who has definitively moved into the realm of male labor. In fact, the only image in the exhibition that shows women interacting dynamically with their natural surroundings is an imagined view of a Meskwaki mother and daughter from an illustration in the children's book that I mentioned before. And I don't think that it's accidental that it's a cross-cultural representation that is the one that gives a female figure the greatest agency. A closer view of the two of the artworks in the exhibition is a way to trace not only expected gender patterns in relation to humans shown with non-human nature, but also their complexity. The unidentified portrait painted by Louise Orwig depicts a woman looking intently at a pitcher. Several other vessels on the highly polished table have already received her scrutiny. The woman and the objects take up 2/3 of the composition, while the remaining third shows a window and a blurry view of the landscape. This view of the landscape is mediated by a vase of cut flowers. The flowers come from the outside, probably from a nearby garden, but they have been selected and arranged as part of the interior decoration. They are clearly domesticated. The blues and reds of the woman's dress connect her primarily to the objects on the table and secondarily to the vase of flowers, not as much to the greens and yellows of the view outside the window. The male figure in young corn instead seems to grow out of the cornfield. And if you look at the drawing carefully, you'll see that the lower body, where it intersects with the field, is very ambiguous. It's actually blurred. It's hard to know where he ends and the field begins. Like Orwig's subject, he holds something with care. In this case, a plant versus a human-crafted object. He's positioned between two landmark structures that mark the horizon. As Dr. DeLong pointed out last night, both a telephone pole, which we see at left, and the church at right. The influential art critic John Berger once wrote that it's possible to see whether gender is a factor in an artwork by imagining the same scene inhabited by a person of another sex. And I wanted to make a couple comparisons to give you the ability to make those kinds of comparisons. So here, comparing a portrait by Orwig in the exhibition with one that is not in the show, but is a portrait of a male figure. They're quite similar in having their subjects absorbed in an activity in proximity to a window. However, their actions seem to be more in keeping with expected gender roles. The female figure is surrounded by functional but also beautiful objects, while the male figure has only his reading material. The man seems more removed from his surroundings in a different way than most of the landscapes that I've seen. He is not obviously a hunter or a farmer. His separation from the landscape is signaled by the dramatic difference in palette, distinguishing outside from inside, and the absence of the type of bridge to the outside provided by the bouquet in the other painting. Although I would not say that the female figure is presented as frivolous in any way, the intentness of her gaze challenges any such reading. There seems more permeability between interior and exterior in her portrait. And this, I think, is more evident when we see it placed beside the male portrait. It's more possible to imagine in the pose of reading than the male figure being inserted into the painting on the left. And in one final example, again, pairing an artwork from the exhibition with one not in the exhibition, Grant Wood's painting of his mother, Women with Plants, offers another way to think about Magritte's drawing in terms of gender. Both figures stand against the landscape backdrop, situating themselves in established rural communities, and both holding a cultivated plant close to their bodies. In expected terms, even though Wood's mother is shown outdoors, the types of potted plants and the apron over her dress position her in domestic terms. In contrast, the male figure in Magritte's work has his shirt sleeves rolled up, and there's a correlation between the plant he holds and the neat rows of corn behind him. The implication is that he interacts directly with the earth. Although it's still difficult to imagine each figure inhabiting the other artwork, there is a tenderness in the way that the male figure holds the corn plant. And Leah DeLong mentioned this last night as well. He cradles its roots, and I think that challenges some of our expectations. This clear evidence of nurturing, a supposed feminine trait, complicates our view. In Magritte's vision, the agricultural richness and vitality of the Iowa landscape is presented as the result of diligence and love. Nurturing is depicted here as the vocation of a man. This could be seen as usurping one of the few beneficial attributes historically associated with the feminine, or more generously to suggest that gender binaries are always more complicated than we imagine. Thank you.
So what I'd like to do now is have all three of our speakers that just address different elements of landscape come up and invite you to ask any questions that you have of them. I finally have remembered that I should be passing around the mic while you do questions so that you can all hear each other. So I will, please raise your hand and I'll come over and give you the mic.
To the professor from Drake, a fascinating painting that isn't in the collection here, Grant Wood's Arbor Day, illustrates your theme. The children planting the tree, the teacher standing by letting them plant the tree, the schoolgirls sitting on the steps in front of the schools, the boys out playing. That illustrates perfectly the theme that you were addressing. So that's just a comment.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I hadn't thought of that example.
I just wanted to make one comment for Lee's presentation. There's been a lot of discussion today about the impact of the Works Progress Administration and the artistic legacies, but there's another one that relates directly to the land, not the CCC. I'm talking about the Soil Conservation Service and soil conservation districts, which are the only soil conservation districts, are the only, shall we say, New Deal legacy that still exists today.
Yeah, very active. They're very active, as Catherine knows. Yep. Thank you.
Jerome, the Iowa is basically, the boundaries of Iowa are basically our boundaries, our lands. The reason why they were trying to get the land up in Minnesota is that that was our northern boundary. So that would have been Iowa if they would have let that happen. But the Sioux protested and got the line to go down, which wasn't right. It should have been, Iowa should have been north.
We should have had the Mall of America.
Yeah.
Other questions? Other questions for each other?
Well, I did think that one point that was interesting is that the three categories that you mentioned in your presentation, I think in a way were reflected in our three, thinking about soil, thinking about ownership, thinking about other kinds of social constructions and landscape. So in a way, even though we didn't plan it, it seems like those different ways that you can regard land were reflected, in the observations that we were making, and that they're not mutually exclusive, but we often don't think of them simultaneously.
Right, we try to work one compartment or another. Yep.
I actually have a question for Lee. So thinking about, you talked a lot about the formations, kind of geological formations, and I'd wonder if you could speak a little bit to the ecological shift of the state, or just how you kind of talked about how we have this brown land and then we get access to that black soil. And so maybe, I guess, just expound on sort of that idea of how much of that black soil is, kind of there, or, how do we still, obviously we use that black soil, but a little bit about that evolution of how we've changed the landscape or altered it in a...
Sure. Well, that's a fun question, Lila. On all this topic, and everyone here is qualified. Jerome's as qualified as I am to speak about this. But the first rule of animal kingdoms is we try to make the world around us better. And I can speak that way from ants, or I can speak that way from humans. And so as one group or another has been living in what we now call Iowa, we keep trying to modify it, possibly through some sort of fire system, possibly through some other thing. But here in Iowa, the simplest way to say it is, we have this 36 million acres, 56,000 square miles, whatever we want to say, Buried underneath it, we've put, especially in these black soils, we've put at least 1 million miles of buried perforated pipe tile lines so that we can lower the water table so we don't have as many sedges and cattails like we saw being harvested. Instead, we can grow corn. And so that's been one of these major changes. But we could talk about every other. I can be here for weeks and months.
No,
but we're changing things.
An unfairly big question.
And then the same thing too. You know what? To tell you a little bit differently, the roads, the highway systems. Many of our bridges are collapsing in part because the very way we manage the land and the water as a result, we're changing the balance of energy. So everything about it is we're trying to manage it to improve it to fit our value systems, fit what we think is right. But there's all these feedback mechanisms. So anyway, I didn't answer the question very well, but fun question.
No, thank you. Other questions? Yes.
Thanks. Yeah, this question perhaps Jerome can answer. You showed a survey map of Iowa. In fact, it's the same one that's in the booklet we have in the focus on Native communities. And I'm assuming that must be pre-1860 because it doesn't show Ames on the map.
Yeah, that is was done in the about 1846, 47.
Okay, well, I was struck in looking at it how many towns are indicated on there. It looks like just about all of the modern county seats have already been established. At least one town every 30 or miles or so. Are these just imaginary, or were there actually that many settled communities then?
No, particularly up in northwest Iowa, the land surveys up in the Iowa Great Lakes region and everything were not done until about 1860, just before the Civil War. And of course, that was one of the later areas to be settled in the state in terms of Euro-American settlement. Now, along the Missouri River, along the Big Sioux River, there were communities along there, but there's a good chance that there's a look ahead for what you want to have. So the survey map that I showed of Ames, Iowa, for instance, that was done before the city was, or the town was actually platted. So that this area of the state, central part of the state, was surveyed mostly by 1848. But like I said, the Northwest regions, and as that was newly ceded territory from the Dakota in the 1851 treaty, so there was a delay in that activity in the state.
Could I hog this to ask Lee a question?
Sure.
I mean, one of the sections of the exhibits is on pottery, ceramics in Iowa. Were there certain parts of the state that were better for potting material? Because I know potters are very peculiar about the quality of what they dig out of a riverbank.
Very much so. Parts of Iowa are, especially where we see some bedrock exposed, so along the Des Moines River, along the Mississippi River, and some other more local, just associated with hills, there is shales that are kaolinitic that work very, very well for pottery. Alternatively, most shallow stuff we find all over the state is the wrong type of mineralogy, and it makes beautiful pots until you fire it, and then it cracks like you can't believe. So we see the pottery being associated with certain areas where you could get these really nice shale deposits, and there's a pattern to them. And actually in the late 1800s, early 1900s, beyond potteries, there was a tremendous amount of clay work, firing bricks for many, many local communities, or these tile lines, things we call tile, but this ceramic that we could put in the ground and put in lines with a slight gradient to remove water. So there used to be tile factories all over the place, and we forgot because we don't need them anymore.
Iowa State was kind of on the edge where, through ceramic engineering, they were looking at uses of those natural materials and promoting their use. For instance, as you go north and west of Ames here, up towards Fort Dodge, the number of tile barns or tile corn cribs or tile outbuildings that you see largely becomes from Iowa State being the promoter of such things.
Right. Yeah, there was.
Well, and also, all of our Iowa State College pottery made in the 1920s. Paul Cox, when he came here from New Orleans, where he worked at Newcomb Pottery and American Art Pottery, came here to Iowa and wanted to start a similar system and wanted to only use the clays of Iowa.
Local.
So each piece of Iowa State
Yeah.
pottery is actually Iowa clay, depicting flora and fauna and designed and decorated flora and fauna of Iowa. And so he really then went around and promoted,
Right.
as the head of ceramics engineering here, this is what we can do with Iowa clays.
Right.
And would have little booths at women's fairs and things like that, and women's groups to talk about. And so it's interesting that we were using it. He really wanted to
Right.
use it for both art and both.
Right. It's both. By the way, kaolinite is the clay mineral that we use to make pottery. There are lots of clay minerals, but kaolinite's the mineral name. And the world's best kaolinite, if you're a crystallographer, comes from Keokuk, Iowa. Very, very. So.
Could I not neglect our colleague from Drake?
Excellent.
Someone mentioned Grant Wood's Arbor Day, as an interesting example of genderized things. There, of course, the female is the agent, who is helping the kids plant the tree there. And it's interesting that when that painting was chosen to be the image used for the Iowa State Quarter, about 15 years ago or so, various changes were made. Like they got rid of the outhouse that was in back, and I think they changed some of the relationships between the. It'd be an interesting thing to see what was censored. When that was made. And I always wondered about that incident of the choosing of that painting, because just like Grant Wood's American Gothic, that's a painting that's not in Iowa. At least up to a few years ago, it was owned by the Koch family in Omaha, as one of their treasures of, traditional American values kind of thing. So I always wondered about the politics of how that ended up, on the quarter. I think there's an essay in that for someone somewhere. But thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I might be putting you guys on the spot, but we seem to be talking about property, and that's a really comfortable subject for us white guys that live and breathe property and own houses and things. And I'm intrigued by the Native American perspective of not having property, and I don't know if there's any evidence of this exhibition at all of their perspective on property. I see a lot of it from our white perspective all the way to regarding women almost as property. This is kind of putting you guys on the spot, but do you see anything on the fly that would reflect a Native American's perspective on ownership and land and territory?
Well, I think going back to the Wakizashi drawing that's included in the exhibition, I think that is a really profound kind of counter to the idea of property, because you see this range of animals, a kind of diversity of animal life, and the presumption is that that is being sustained, in part because of human practices, behaviors, because there are humans that are pictured within that drawing too, and there's also this acknowledgement of a spiritual connection among humans and the land and the animals. So, I do think that that is an explicit articulation of an alternative way of thinking about humans' relationship to their environment.
Thank you. I think that's a very good observation, and that's a very good question. That same drawing, try to think of the energy going both ways. Many American audiences are imagining the power going from the animal or the creature to the human. But the energy also goes back the other way. So it's more like, you hear the saying of, we're all connected, that type of thing. And I think that was an attempt by many Native Americans to explain a worldview. How are we connected to each other? What are we connected to? When I was young, we had a house, and there was a pond down below, and my grandfather and my grandmother and I were walking up from the pond, and I got up to the top, and I thought, I bet I could throw a rock from up here and hit that pond down there. And I was probably like 4, and there was no way I could do it. But I tried because I was young, and that's what you do when you're young, is you try. So I suddenly reached down and picked up this rock and flung it, and it probably only went about 10 feet and rolled down the hill. And my grandfather turned to me, and in Indian, he asked me, why did you do that? And I said, well, I was trying to see if I could get the rock down to the pond. And he said, you've just separated that rock from its family. Do you know how long it's going to take everything to get together again? And I was just horrified, and I said, well, rocks aren't alive. And he said, why would you think they aren't? I said, because they don't move. And he said, do trees move? I said, well, they don't walk, but you can see them get bigger. So here I'm trying to win this argument because I don't want to get in trouble. So I said, well, no, they don't walk, but they grow. And you can see them lose leaves, and then they go to sleep, and then they get leaves, more leaves, and we get sap from them, and we make maple sugar. So I think they're alive. And he said, so you think just because you can't see something move, that means it's not alive? And I thought, holy cow, that poor rock. And there's a thing on YouTube, and it's the coolest thing. It's called Das Road, and I think it's German. Those Germans are always up to all kinds of innovative stuff. And it's told from the perspective of these 2 piles of rocks over a period of time. And they see, this development going on, mountains and trees and everything, but the time is going so fast that it's just daylight all the time because it's just a blur. And with Native Americans, we get asked, what religion is your religion most like? Because everybody wants us to say Methodist, or, we're really like the Mormons, or no, Buddhists, that's like us. They really want us to pick something. And it has taken the world a long time to get to a point where we can confidently say, our religion isn't like your religions. Our religion is like quantum theory and quantum physics. Our religion is like science. When we're talking about everything is connected, we're not talking about kumbaya, let's all hold hands and go down to the river. We're talking about on a subatomic level. We're talking about the transference of energy. We're talking about the creation of oxygen. We're talking about moving existence from one type to another. So when we say we're connected to the land, we're not just talking about our dead people laying in it. I mean, if it wasn't for the things going on in the water and the land, the earth would catch on fire. I mean, that's where the oxygen comes. That's where it all happens. And when we say it's all connected, we say that rocks are a people. They're not human beings, but they're a people. We say that trees are a people. They're not human beings, but they're people too. Trees fall in love. They talk to each other. And that's when they're pollinating, and you don't know who hooked up until the fall, and later it's like, oh my gosh, look, there's a tiny tree over there. And they do all of that without walking. So if it hadn't been for my grandfather saying, get out of looking at it from your own tiny little perspective, who are you to judge what's alive and what's real? Just because you don't see it move. And the older I've gotten, the more that's applied to other people. There might be someone with their crabby attitude in Walmart next to me, and I'm thinking, what did I do to them? Well, you know what? It probably has nothing to do with me. Maybe they're having just a really stinking bad day. Has nothing to do with anything I've done. And we have to kind of get off our high horse thinking that we're what the world is going around. So our religion is actually science. So when I hear about science, and I hear science, and I hear science, now we're talking Meskwaki. Now we're talking how we see the world.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that and kind of tie a couple of things together with a little bit of an art historical observation. But you asked about where in the exhibition we see the native view of the land. And you're right, I believe, with that drawing. And the way that it doesn't have a horizon line is really essential in terms of the way Euro-Americans expect to see landscape and land. We have our position and we view it with that horizon line. That dates back at least to the Renaissance with this notion of man as the measure of all things and seeing it from our perspective, which puts that as an other. We are in opposition to it. And so that is so completely different from what she was just describing. In the native perspective, there is no other. And we see that embedded in centuries of Euro-American and European art. But it even translates into gendered issues and into land management issues and ownership issues in all kinds of ways. And so if you just start thinking about that oppositional relationship that we somehow get to define the other, it translates into virtually everything we do with land today, much to the environment's detriment. And even the vocabulary we use, which goes to the gendered issues, we use things, words like virgin land, or husbanding the land, or the lay of the land, which has all kinds of interesting sexual connotations, but dominant kinds of issues, and masculine impositions. There are paintings that actually go to the heart of that, and Leah knows of Alexander Hoag's Mother Earth Laid Bare, in which the landscape is literally a female figure lying barren with a plow in the foreground that is essentially the perpetrator that has raped her. There's all kinds of layers and layers of this, but it ultimately goes to, I think, the Euro perspective of us as viewers, the land as other, that we can make into something else. And that's completely antithetical to the native perspective. It's so hard for us who have been acculturated to centuries of European perspectives to understand that interconnectedness where there is no other, that humans are part of the larger environment in a completely integrated way, so that we have trouble seeing their art as art because it doesn't conform to those perspectives. There are no horizon lines in Native American views of land and people's places in it.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your insightful comments. Let's give one more round of applause for our speakers.
Nice job, you guys. Nice job.